Hi everybody, this is Saad for the Sad Truth. A few days ago I read a article that summarized a recent study that came out of the program on terrorism and low intensity conflict at Tel Aviv University's Institute for National Security Studies. Anyways, I'll put you a link to the article in question. Uh, in the article, the researchers coded all of the suicide attacks that were carried out in 2015, and they used a very conservative methodology to define what constitutes a suicide attack. So, for example, you had to have two established sources reporting on the terrorist attack before you could uh, count it. Uh, Also, in the case, for example, of the recent Paris attacks, where you had, I think, seven suicide bombers or attackers, they counted that whole, the seven incidents as a singular event. And so these numbers, if anything, are quite conservative. And so there were 452 suicide attacks in 2015. And of course, one of the things that one wants to do in looking at such data is to then look at, well, what might be some common traits that might help us differentiate or discriminate between those who commit the acts versus those who don't. Or even within those who commit the acts, are there particular characteristics that can help us understand, if there's a greater likelihood of one group to commit such acts? Is it that they're younger? Is it that they're taller? Is it that they have green eyes? Is it that they're men or women? Is it that they like Manchester City? What might help us predict who is motivated to commit such suicide attacks? And so, without further ado, let me read you exactly what the researchers found. This is quoted from the article in question, so I begin the quote here. Of course, we cannot avoid mentioning the religious element as the most significant factor that motivates the suicide terrorists throughout the world. Here's the most dramatic statistic: 450 of 452 suicide terror attacks in 2015 were perpetrated by Muslim extremists. One of the remaining two attacks was carried out by the Kurdish underground. The other was perpetrated by a woman supporter of a leftist group in Turkey. In other words, even the two out of the 452 that were not linked to so-called Muslim extremists were very likely to be Muslim. In one case, you have Kurds. In the other case, it is a Turkish woman. Turkey is, I think, 99% Muslim, so we can assume that 452 out of 452 involved one religion. But if we want to be more charitable, 450 out of 452 involved religious extremists of one religion. So let's put this in context in terms of statistical analyses. In the social sciences, when you say run a regression model to try to predict, which variables might be correlated to a particular dependent variable, if you get what is known as an R squared captures the percentage of variance explained of the model. It basically captures, how well does the data fit the optimal model. Well, if you get an R square of, say, 0.2 or 0.3, meaning 30%, 20% to 30% of the data is explained, you're jumping up and down with joy. In other words, in the social sciences, when you publish top papers in top scientific journals, if you're getting an R squared of 0.3, you're typically quite happy. Now, as you go to the natural sciences, the number, the R squared becomes much higher. So, for example, there was a study that was done recently where they looked at ecology papers that were published in the journal Science in 2000, and I'm going on memory here, the R squared was 0.51. So as you get into the so-called harder sciences, the R squared goes up, but again, you realize that you're publishing papers here in elite journals such as Science, and if you're getting a 0.5, meaning 50% of the variance explained, you're feeling pretty good about things. Well, what do you think is the statistical fit, using any measure that you'd like, of 450 out of 452. In other words, no scientist could ever dream of having data that is remotely as unequivocal as this. I mean, as a matter of fact, it's 452 out of 452 if we take into account what I mentioned earlier. Now, let's try to apply these findings using the Aslan-Uygur decoder 5000. Well, the first thing, if you entered this data or these findings into the decoder, you'd get back is, what do you think it will be? Well, you got to shoot the messenger. Hey, come on now. This study was conducted in Israel. It was reported by the Times of Israel. Clearly, it's Zionist Jewish propaganda. This data is completely nonsense. So that's the first thing that the decoder would come up with. Another thing that the decoder can come up with, depending on whether you've updated all of the right modules so that you have the latest version of the decoder, it would tell you that in reality, in those 452 cases, those were actually Jewish agents posing as Muslim extremists, because of course they want to find a way to propagandize, in the battlefield of ideas. And so, if anything, this demonstrates nothing about Islamic extremism. It's Jews that are pretending to be Muslim. Now, again, depending on whether you've got the updated model, the next thing that could be argued is, so what if 452 out of 452 involve members of one group? Not all. Remember, not all. So depending on how much you dig into the Aslan-Uygur decoder 5000, you can always find a way to take data such as 452 out of 452 global attacks. This spans very different cultures, different ethnicities, different races, different political realities, yet they share one commonality. But of course, we all know that it would be racist, bigoted, and phobic. And so I feel a lot more comfortable, since I am a huge Bill Nye fan, to find a way to link all of these 450 out of 452 cases to climate change. To me, it seems like that's a much more parsimonious explanation. And so there you have it, folks. You've got to be progressive. You've got to be politically correct. We've got to solve this whole climate change so that these suicide attacks can go away. Have a great week, everybody. Talk to you soon. Ciao.